Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am outside Cork Synagogue, or what was Cork Synagogue. The Star of David had been removed. That's because it's been deconsecrated for the Judaic faith, and it's been sold to the Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian denomination. So anyway, Freddy Rosehill was the last president of the synagogue. He wasn't a rabbi, he was a layman. And I was in correspondence with him by email years ago. I remember coming back in 2010, looking him up in the phone book, considering calling him. To my lasting regret, I didn't, because he's been called to the great big synagogue in the sky. So for decades, he fought gallantly, fought the losing battle, because you can't beat demographics. And when he died, there were only 2 Jewish people left in the city, 2 Jewesses, his daughter, who married a Gentile man, and his granddaughter. Mr. Rosehill's grandson has gone overseas, and he also had a son who went abroad. And that's it. That is the size of the Jewish community in Cork. Apparently there might be some Jewish people in the countryside. I knew a Jewish American chap living near Rosehill, but he died 20 years ago. And that's that. So Mr. Rosehill's family, they came from, I think it was Lithuania, the late 19th century. And their surname was obviously Rosenberg, but they anglicized it to Rosehill. So what else? Obviously been Jewish people in Ireland since the Middle Ages. The Annals of the Four Masters mentions that. Then in the 16th century, there were some crypto Jews from Spain and Portugal who came here, who conformed outwardly to Christianity. One that was Mayor of Youghal, can't think who else. And so Anglo Jewry moved over here, and they were almost entirely based in Dublin. But then in the late 19th century, there was more. In the 18th century, some Portuguese Jews had moved here, but they intermarried with the Protestant community. They just disappeared into mainstream society. But the late 19th century, there was a wave of pogroms in the Tsarist Empire. There was a Pale of settlement, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, the western regions of the Russian Empire. Only their Jews were allowed to settle, which obviously was particularly unfortunate because that put them in the path of the Wehrmacht when it came through in 1941. But anyway, because they're so persecuted, many of them chose to move overseas, particularly they wanted to shift to the United States. But some of them were tricked into disembarking the boat at Queenstown, that's now a cove, because they didn't know where they were, they didn't speak English. The captain said, "This is the United States." They got off the ship, sailed away, that was that. They were here in Ireland. So imagine how difficult it would be to live in Ireland if you didn't speak English, and we were not a wealthy country at all, and there was a bit of anti-Semitism around. So that's that. Curiously, some of them had to make their living selling Catholic paraphernalia. Catholicism is a very optic sort of denomination, so selling statues of the Blessed Virgin and so forth. So Mr. Rosehill's father, I think, might have been doing that. So that's that. You can see documentaries about that. There was a very prominent Mr. Goldberg, who was Lord Mayor of Cork, who was a Fianna Fáiler, who died something like 10 years ago. And that's that. So the Magan David's been removed. It used to be painted grey. I've never been inside, unfortunately. But Mr. Rosehill, when he was still alive, he used to give people tours of it for free, which is an awful pity. And he said, you go back to the 1930s, they were standing remotely. There were little plaques there. There's Shalom Park, which is not far away, that away, which is where the Jewish community initially settled. Jews came down from Limerick, where there was the so-called Limerick pogrom. Nobody was killed. There's only one minor act of violence in the so-called Limerick pogrom in about 1910. So that was that. So there was a tiny Jewish community in Cork. Everybody knew everybody. Cecil Hurwitz was a prominent member of it. You should read his book, From Synagogue to Church. I believe Mr. Hurwitz has unfortunately passed away. So his father was a moneylender who had an office just off the South Mall, and did well for himself. Mr. Hurwitz, he went to UCC, it's University College Cork, reading medicine. He decided to convert to Christianity, and that obviously did not play well with his family. It was June 1948 he did it, the month after Israel was founded, and the Holocaust had only ended 3 years earlier. So there was a very strong sense that Jewish people had to stick together and keep the faith. 1/3 of Jewish people on the planet had just been murdered, so they did not take it well that he was converting to Christianity. So initially he was spurned by the rest of this tiny community, which must have hurt. He was forced to abandon his studies for financial reasons. Remember, no grants back then. Most people were leaving school at the age of 14. Very few people pursued tertiary education in the 1940s. He married his fiancée, who was a cradle Catholic. They had some children, blah, blah, blah. he wasn't able to continue medicine. When he eventually could afford to go back to UCC as a qualified as a teacher, he did that. So a very loving man, someone Christian in the really proper sense of the word, helping to foster children, especially children from the north of Ireland during the Troubles. That was Mr. Hurwitz. That's that. Cork Synagogue. I mean, I wish I could go inside sometime. I wish they'd done something like make into some sort of visitor centre. But anyway, the Adventists have it, so serving a similar purpose, making other people happy, providing some sort of social glue for them and consolation in times of grief, and focal point for celebrations, baptisms, and weddings and so forth. So therefore, serving a worthy purpose too. There's some Jewish cemetery outside the city, as Mr. Rosehill had said. The first thing that the Jewish community would establish is a burial society, only later the place of assembly. So they didn't have a minyan for ages, as in they weren't quorate, at least 10 men who'd been through bar mitzvah, being a son of the law, a bit like confirmation. So occasionally people would come down from Dublin to make up the numbers, including Israeli diplomats, people from overseas, and that was that. So that is the former Cork Synagogue.